Putin has returned to this which Trump seems to love. Might is right, right? The bigger countries determine for the smaller countries by use of force and threat, not through negotiation and equal means of dialogue. If you want to talk about Crimea returning to Russian ownership or sovereignty, to return to that word, hold a referendum. Get the United Nations to go in there, hold a legitimate referendum authorized by the United Nations Security Council, which Russia likes to leverage for various interests. Is that not wrong to do?
Russia actually was fighting for the Crimea for 300 years with the Ottoman Empire. So it was a long period of time when Ukraine never existed. It's about, you mentioned the United Nations and Charter, the UN Charter. And one of the article of the Charter states that nations have the right for self-determination. It is exactly what was used in the Crimea.
This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, where a large proportion, most of what we discuss on here is Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the regime of Putin, the government, Putin, the economy of Russia. The point I'm making here is that we talk about Russia a lot, and as someone who has associations with the country, it's a challenge to know how to balance that. But as I try to do with many of the guests that I invite on and the perspectives that I share or points that I raise, is be cognizant of varied ones. And with that in mind, as the channel and the community continues to grow, something I want to do is engage more people from within Russia. But not just anybody. This isn't suddenly becoming a mouthpiece for Putin or the Kremlin. But what I want to do is hear from people who study economics, study international relations, geopolitics, and those sorts of things to understand the Russian perspective of things, because I think it's important to be aware of that and to continue to engage. So with that in mind, my guest today is someone who I've been in touch with a while, trying to figure out when this would be best to do, Olga Krasnyak. She is a professor at HSE University and focuses on international relations and economics. And what we're going to do is have, I think, a spirited conversation. Olga's told me her perspectives on things in a overviewing sort of sense. But Olga, I think the fairest way to start this off is to perhaps for you to share your initial perspective of things, your background, your views of things, and then we can begin to pick apart things in more detail.
Pyotr, thank you for having me. So yes, I'm in Moscow. I'm Russian, and my first and initial point is that being a patriot and loving my country, loving my fatherland, and basically acknowledging that our national interest, it is something what we share. Sometimes maybe this national interest can be understood differently. But anyways, considering the time of geopolitical tensions, I believe so people with proper proper background and proper training and education should consider and should support their fatherland.
I see, and I want to appreciate that, but you know, well, actually, I'll take a step back, because the reason I encountered you and reached out to you was because you were being interviewed on the BBC. It was during the initial, what the West or the British have called the coalition of the willing. So there were a lot of European leaders in London. I think this was in March, and you were giving a interview to BBC World News, I think it was, from Moscow, and they were engaging a Russian perspective, which I have to be honest, at the time I was quite surprised. At the BBC, they do still have Stephen Rosenberg, the BBC Russian editor in Moscow. But I was quite surprised that the BBC were having a Russian perspective, or someone from within Russia, because often it's usually Russians who are diaspora or who have left the country. And so I was very interested to understand how that came about and sort of what your experience was like dealing with a Western media during a time that we're in now.
Well, indeed, it was a big surprise to me, because I often haven't provided some interview, just my perspective, some expertise in Russian foreign policy. But it would be so-called for the rest of the world, for the world majority channels. And the Western channels, it's not something who contact me very often. But yes, a few times indeed I was contacted and I provided my perspective. And I cannot say so I was somehow instructed what to say or how I should behave. No, so they ask, so what would be my viewpoint? But at the same time, they somehow allowed me to share my view without any interruption. So I think it's a good sign from the Western media.
Interesting, because there's a lot of well, in the West we would say pro-Putinists, or people who are more aligned to the Russian perspective, or the government's perspective more specifically, perhaps, that the West is incredibly biased. There is never any opportunity for people based in Russia or who take more of a Russian perspective to vocalize themselves in Western media. And you're saying that that's not necessarily the case.
Well, indeed, I cannot say it happens very often when I could be contacted by Western media, but I had a few times. So, but as you mentioned about Putinism or pro-Kremlin or something, I think those stereotypes are used by Western media. When Russian commentators of people who live in Russia and who support their fatherland, and so they share their views, and it's not unnecessary according to the official narrative, but according to certain perceptions which we share. And it's something what gives the line of putting all these people in, as me as pro-Putinist. So I think it's a stereotype, and probably we should go beyond of it. So, and listening to other perspective and listening at least other explanation, being not so arrogant, and considering that other people from other countries, they think in a bit different way and have maybe a bit different interpretation. So maybe it's a starting point to have actually a conversation.
So I have two things to ask you on that then. The first one is you've mentioned now the patriotism of the fatherland, right? Which is quite strong wording. But how do you define a difference between your patriotism for Russia or the country versus support or the official narrative? Because at this point they're one and the same. Putin has done such a good job of controlling the narrative, ensuring that there is really only one perspective in the country. Or you disagree with that? Because for me, I struggle to see how, I want to be proud of Russia or patriotism, sure, but unless you denounce the war or something like that, then it seems very difficult to make that distinction.
Well, I would not distinct all these things. So, and I would not agree. So we have a narrative which controlled by Putin, and this narrative just should be promoted. Maybe the situation is more complicated inside because when we consider this narrative, let's call it official narrative. So we think about national interests, and national interests is a way how we understand them. And those national interests, they include our perceptions about our sovereignty, and sovereignty in its true meaning. And sovereignty, it's not having a flag or anthem or something, but the sovereignty, it's an ability of a nation state to make its own independent decision regarding foreign policy and domestic policy. And the essence of sovereignty, this is the essence of national interest. I believe it is something what we have. It's something what we try to make stronger. So this is exactly the national interest. So without consulting with Western countries, without consulting with some patron states, as some other countries they actually do. And I think when we think about national interest and patriotism and having this official narrative, we are indeed understand what it means having sovereignty, and that would be like a true the essence of this notion of something what can be included in the official narrative. But also different parts of or branches of sovereignty, they are also just can be taken as additional parts. Let's say it's technological sovereignty or economic sovereignty or even human rights sovereignty. So it's our view, it's our vision, it's our way of doing the things and understanding the things. And I think this is something what we can include into official narrative, international interest, and I believe so in the larger scale within our country, it is something what the majority of people they do share.
In principle, I can understand where you're coming from. The idea of sovereignty, territorial integrity, national security, these are all terms and phrases that we hear often in political discourse, be it in the West, right? And I, as someone who perhaps for better or for worse, am critical of the West more often than some others. I try to engage people from the global South. I have a lot of people who are very pro-India, for example, or I've had some people who are more sympathetic to the Chinese perspective, critical. I've had some people from the Middle East who are more critical of Israel, and I try to engage different sides, even if they don't necessarily align with my principled views, right? But at the same time, I don't think that the point is about sovereignty as much as it is about how you go about trying to enforce said sovereignty. And what I mean specifically is that this entire war is on the basis that Russia is, from the Russian perspective, protecting national interest, security, and its sovereignty, or the Russian ethnic peoples, right? That's some of the points that would be made by, I don't know, the official narrative, right? But we don't live in a world where you use war to do so, right? I think the main point people have is that Russia could have a civilized discussion with Ukraine about things if they just left Ukraine and stopped using war or kinetic warfare as the means by which to get their interests, right? Do you not agree that this could be
I
done
would
better
not
than
agree.
a war? Why?
I understand. I understand your point. I totally disagree, or just cannot agree on this type of interpretation, because we would not start, and we should not probably start with Russia just which initiated this war, and in the Western narrative, it's called an aggression, it's called this full-scale invasion, or whatever. So we know all these wordings used in the Western narrative, but we need to consider maybe from the different perspective. From the perspective of the containment policies, which are pushed by Western countries, well, at least since the Cold War. But if we look deep into history, we would see even different examples of in the centuries back, when the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, it was constantly was contained by Western powers. And if we consider the containment policy is the main narrative and the main action of Western countries, so we would see that Russia's foreign policy, with the understanding of sovereignty, national interest, and everything, that would be a reaction. It would be the reaction of these containment policies. Okay, so you mentioned about Ukraine. It is something that we talk about almost 4 years in the media or everywhere. Russia will not leave, of course, and will not stop until our aim and our gains will be achieved. But what happened previously? So we're not even looking about Donbas situation, when Kiev regime bombed Donbas since 2014. But look, in the previous years, with the enlargement of NATO to east, and including to the Black Sea, and these conversations or situation with Georgia and then with Ukraine. So well, it didn't happen. The enlargement of NATO through the Black Sea, well, it did not happen. But it is a part of containment policy which Russia should react, and Russia did indeed react on this situation. So, well, if we look from this perspective, maybe Russian behavior and Russian point of view will be more understandable. I'm not really sure it would be acceptable, but at least it should be more understandable from Western perspective. It's not Russia is bad and started this war in Ukraine. No, it was a reaction on the containment policy when Russia, of course, used all these diplomatic means with the Minsk agreements and Minsk one, Minsk two, but it did not work out. So in this case, yes, having a war, this type of actions as a way, as a means to resolve initial problems. Well,
Olga,
yes, it was started.
yeah, I mean, look, we can go round about I've had these debates countless times about, and the thing that I think makes me slightly different to many Western commentators, I don't know what word to really use to describe myself, is that I am cognizant or more sympathetic to or aware of the feelings that Russians or Russia, whatever, may have felt in the growth of NATO. I can understand that. And I do think that more should have been done, a better job should have been done to engage or alleviate Russia's concerns about the growth of NATO. However, NATO is a voluntary organization which countries choose to join out of their own free will. Article 13 means that they can leave whenever they want. And so this whole point that sort of NATO and containment It was because a lot of the countries, especially the Baltics, where we've seen some rather provocative moves by Russia in the past few weeks, were fearful of being dominated or subjugated. What's happening now? So while I understand, to use your word, I find it very difficult to accept this simply because it's not as clear cut as during the early 2000s, right? Let's be more specific. During the early 2000s, the former General Secretary of NATO, George Robertson, there's a picture of him shaking hands, and they're very cordial and good friends with Putin, right? It was partially because NATO saw Putin's response to the Chechen wars as well, maybe not positive, but sort of Russia could be a strong partner in counterterrorism. And then when Putin pledged support to the United States after 9/11, there was a very good opportunity to see Russo-NATO relations, right? The NATO-Russian Council, the founding act of 1997 under Clinton, right? I'm just dropping in some different things here. However, when Putin decided to undertake a military operation in Georgia in 2008, yes, you can talk about the comments by the West about Georgia and Ukraine eventually being part in NATO. That's what I mean by I think that could have been better framed from the West. But the point is that Putin moved to using military coercion to change things. And I just don't see how that is the same as the provocations or enlargement that you're talking about with NATO. Yes, NATO is problematic for Russian national security, but NATO has never launched a military operation into Russian territory. Russia has done that with Georgia.
I understand your point. By the end of the Soviet Union, before it collapsed, Gorbachev first and then Putin from the beginning of being in power. So they actually initiated the conversation when Russia would join NATO, and it did not happen. So it's historical facts. It's not my fantasy. So it is something what we can find. So this information, if we just simply Google it, and Russia was denied a membership in NATO. So and actually it explains what would be the nature of NATO. And the nature of NATO, and I'm totally and absolutely sure it would be the containment of Russia. And of course we can say so. NATO never initiated some military operations, but it's simply it's not true. So if we talk about the former Yugoslavia, for instance, but even just leaving all these things apart, so the nature of NATO is the containment of Russia. And when Russia suggested just to be part of NATO and it was denied the access to NATO, it means simply, the essence, it's about just to do something against Russia. And no matter of all these proclamations about this defensive mood or defensive essence or defensive attitude of NATO. No, we do not believe it. And of course, also some conversations about non-enlargement NATO in the early 2000s, about non-enlargement NATO to the east, well, it was all ignored. And of course, Russia's concerns, they were not taken into account. So in this case, from Russian perspective, I can assure you, so we do not consider NATO as totally as an offensive alliance. They just with some peaceful purposes, having peaceful purposes in mind, not in mind. It's totally the opposite. And if we look at the Indo-Pacific or into the Asia-Pacific, we see the similar attitude from NATO countries just to include Japan or South Korea or somehow Taiwan in this military framework. So definitely it's not for peaceful purposes. Maybe it's certainly like a preparation for future conflict. Maybe it's just a deterrence. Could be this way, but definitely thinking that it's a totally peaceful attitude coming from NATO, I think it's a huge mistake.
But there's a difference between peaceful or offensive. You still haven't addressed the point, which is that NATO, yes, it has the provocations. And as I've said, I've tried to give some leniency to the point about how Russia may feel about this big organization. And I don't disagree with you, actually, that quite clearly, well, we can talk about technically the Soviet Union applied to join NATO, I believe, in 1954. Wasn't it? On the early 50s, there was an attempt by Soviet Union to join NATO. So, there have been attempts by various leaders of the Soviet Union or Russia to do something close with NATO. But the point is that NATO's operations in Yugoslavia, in Libya, for better or for worse, they were interventionary, but they were not wars of basically conquest. What Russia did in Georgia in 2008, the events over Crimea, and the events in Ukraine from 2014 until 2022, and thus on from then, are not the same. They involve military action when you could have utilized other means, right? If you want to talk about whether Crimea should be part of Russia again because Khrushchev gave it in 1954, okay, we can have that conversation, but we're not in a world now where you use forcible coercion to get what you want. Putin has returned to this, which Trump seems to love. Might is right, right? The bigger countries determine for the smaller countries by use of force and threat, not through negotiation and equal means of dialogue, right? Is what I'm saying. And so, anyway, if you want to talk about Crimea returning to Russian ownership or sovereignty, to return to that word, hold a referendum. Get the United Nations to go in there, hold a legitimate referendum authorized by the United States, United Nations Security Council, which Russia likes to leverage for various interests. Well, actually, I'll give you a really random example. Last week, Morocco pushed a motion which the United States backed through the UN Security Council to recognize Western Sahara, this big bit of land underneath Morocco, as part of it. And Russia abstained. They didn't vote on it. So it shows you, and the Chinese, they do leverage international law when it benefits. But in this case, Russia was like, nah, let's just take Crimea back instead of using the UN. Why? Why is that not wrong to do?
No, first, it's not about the Khrushchev era, which was from technical and maybe geographical point of view, became somehow a part of Soviet Ukraine, which, by the way, never existed before the Soviet Union. So Ukraine is a state, it's just totally artificial creature of the Soviet Russia. But Russia actually was fighting for the Crimea for 300 years with the Ottoman Empire. So it was long period of time. And basically, when Ukraine never existed. So it's not even, once again, a Khrushchev era. It way before, for the centuries before. So we've been fighting for 300 years. So first point. The second point, number two, it's about, you mentioned the United Nations and Charter, the UN Charter. And one of the article of the Charter states that nations have the right for self-determination. It is exactly what was used in the Crimea, because in 2014, people in Crimea, Russian-speaking people with Russian identity, they had a referendum for the self-determination, and they voted for their right for the self-determination to be part of Russia. So basically, we can use international law interpretation from this exactly point of view and perspective. So Russia indeed behaved as an international responsible player. So of course, so it's not about just asking permission for anyone else. No, it's about just asking people in Crimea. So basically, it is something what was done. And so this is it's not just only, you know, I don't want just to see from Western perspective. So we have just this official narrative and we just push it forward. It is something what we indeed had. And we actually can continue this line with Donbas people, with the DNR and LNR. So because the same attitude and the same, I would say, scheme was used when people in Donbas, they used their right for self-determination. And then Russia came to help these people in Donbas to, you know, just to help them because they've been targeted as an anti-terrorist operation from the Kiev regime. So, and in this case, so this is our interpretation, this is our vision, this is our view of something what happened.
Olga, look, I'm gonna caveat again. I'm trying to be reasonable, right? I'm gonna caveat that the United States often breaches international law. It violates. It hasn't signed or ratified many UN treaties that Russia actually has, or other non-Western nations have. The United States is one of the biggest hypocrites when it preaches about international law, rule of law, or whatever. Right? I'm gonna acknowledge that is a reality. But at the same time, Russia holding a unilateral referendum over Crimea. Do you really think that that's the best way to go about it? Why didn't Russia do it through a medium like the UN, which is precisely meant for these kinds of things? Diplomatic resolution, conflict resolution. territorial recognition, sovereignty, all the buzzwords we want to use, right? Why does it seem sensible or logical for Russia to hold a referendum, which obviously it's then going to be the 99.9% or whatever, the 99.7% of votees voted to return to Russia? It's not a very objective vote. It should have been done through a independent vehicle, not held by the Russians. And this discussion over Eastern Donbass or Luhansk and Donetsk and Eastern Ukraine. Yes, it should go without saying that Eastern Ukraine is very heavily influenced from Russia, from Katerina the Great, Novorossiya, all these historical elements. But it was quite clearly made in 1991 that most people who lived in Ukraine wanted to remain as part of this Ukraine that was there's a big problem there, which is you said Ukraine has never existed. I mean, the people have existed a long time. We can debate about the physical territory of Ukraine, the state versus the nation. The point, if we leave that aside for a moment, because that's a whole other discussion, simply on the Donbass as it is right now, again, holding a referendum on the allegiance or whatever, association with Russia or Ukraine, it should be done through organic, objective, international vehicles, not just from the Russian state. Because there is no way in hell that can be considered fair and legitimate, or you just will never accept that.
Well, I cannot agree with on this because when we talk about Crimea, so you mentioned the different way through this international recognition through the United Nations. Probably it can be used when we talk about newly sovereign or newly independent country. But Crimea is not a country, so it's a part of Russia. So probably if we talk about the Timor-Leste, one of these newly appeared nation states on this political map, but it's a new country. But Crimea, it's not a country. So, and probably this way which you described just cannot be applicable to Crimea. And the second point is about Ukraine. So, well, I understand the Western narrative, which of course disagrees on Russia's perspective on this artificial nature of the state of Ukraine. Because, okay, from historical perspective, we see that the eastern part of Ukraine, it's the Russian Empire territory. We call it Malorussia or Novorossiya, like New Russia or Small Russia. And the western part of Ukraine, it is a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Former Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's a part of Poland as well. So, and where is Ukraine? So, somewhere in the middle, this geographical middle of Ukraine, with some Kazakhs, and those Kazakhs, semi-official, semi-free people, which still had their relation with the Russian Empire. So, and in this case, when we think about Ukraine as a nation state, so about what kind of part of Ukraine we're talking about. So, okay, ask Ukrainian from the western Ukraine. So you would see people from Hungary, from Hungarian identity, people from Polish identity, from Romanian identity, or even some gypsies. So, well, it's not about Ukraine itself. And this western part of Ukraine, it's a result of Stalin geographical obtaining. So, into all these actions which have been taken in 1939 at the very least. So, nonetheless, so I'm confident in making the statements that Ukraine is a nation state. It's a totally artificial, totally superficial creature and done during the Soviet times. But nonetheless, now it's a bit different situation, and probably, it seems to me, so Russia uses its historical right just to make the things right in a way how we understand them, in the way how we perceive our interests.
Palestinians' frustration over Israel, but Israel's not going anywhere now. Like, I feel like this mindset of a lot of Russians or some people in Russia or whatever is, I don't know, explain it to me further, because I'm struggling to understand.
From my point of view, so this colonial narrative, so definitely it is something what Great Britain pursues, and I do not see any signs to somehow just to drop this narrative. Okay, but look at let's have a look at China. So the issue of with Hong Kong and Macau, well, using the historical right and the change in geopolitics and change of economic and technological or any type of Chinese development.